Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Dr. Courtney Flint from ENBS, and apologize for the frog in my throat, but that's the reason for this on my face so that we don't share these croakinesses. I'm glad you're all here, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsten Vinyeta, who's from sociology program. This is the second of her two seminars. So it was a great one yesterday, really thought-provoking, and I think flows right into what we're going to spend some time on today. So Dr. Vinyeta is a qualitative environmental sociologist whose research focuses on the impacts of federal land management and climate change on Indigenous peoples and sovereignty in the United States. And Dr. Vinyeta received her PhD in environmental sciences, studies, and policy at the University of Oregon, and her BS in landscape architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And at the University of Oregon, she was a research fellow for the Tribal Climate Change Project and carried out a community-based participatory research project with the Coquille Indian tribe as part of her master's thesis. And since 2016, she served as a collaborating researcher and illustrator for the Karuk tribe Department of Natural Resources, examining how federal wildfire management policies affect the tribe's ability to adapt to climate change and protect the ecological integrity of the Klamath River Basin. And she writes, as a settler collaborating with Indigenous scholars, professionals, and communities, she's committed to community-based projects that honor Indigenous epistemologies and advance Indigenous sovereignty. And I think Dr. Vinyeta is just a tremendously great example of the real embodiment and practice of cultural humility. And one of the key aspects of cultural humility is having a historical perspective. And so her work really helps us to see the roots of some of the biggest contemporary struggles that we have in natural resource management. And she gives us insights into how we can also look backwards to look forward to make important changes in areas that are really important. So thank you for being here.
Can you? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Courtney. I really appreciate the introduction, and thanks again to the audience. For those of you who were here yesterday, hopefully this will be an extension of what was discussed and an example of some of the ways I have attempted to bridge sociology and ecology, and definitely with the help of my tribal collaborators. And so I hope this will be sort of an extension, an illustration of what might be able to happen, or at least like the seed of what might be able to happen if you integrate the natural sciences and critical sociology. So today's talk is titled Understanding Northern California's Tinderbox Through Settler Colonial Theory. And it is based on my dissertation research, which I concluded in May of this year. It was done in partnership with the Karuk tribe of Northern California. And this project concerns itself with the social, political, and ecological dimensions of fire management in California's Klamath River Basin, which is ripe with a really complex history that we'll start to unpack today. But before we go into that, I had a slide that went missing, but I had a juxtaposition of a historic photo of Karuk ancestral landscapes right along the Klamath River. And I also had next to it a photo of Logan Canyon, in other words, Shoshone ancestral territory. I had found this ancestral photo, or this photo of Shoshone ancestral territory in a search that I'd done for my job talk here, and it came with a caption, and it showed Logan Canyon in 1910, and it was a lot more sparsely vegetated than it is now. And the caption said, "The Shoshone burned the valley frequently to drive the bison and provide better forage for their horses. This impacted the vegetation across the valley and along the river. Instead of large stands of tall trees, the river was lined with shrubs, which responded better to fire, hence the valley's first name, Willow Valley." And you'll see in some people's land acknowledgements the mention of Willow Valley as the territory that we sit upon, right? So there's that history of fire and now the absence of fire in the very place that we're in. And of course, like fire suppression, which is kind of the focus of this talk, federal fire suppression has also led to these really volatile conditions across the West that don't only impact Indigenous peoples and their ability to carry out cultural practices and subsistence activities, but also endanger us all by creating these really volatile conditions that have created these mega fires, right, that threaten indigenous and settlers alike. So it's a topic that should be a relevance to us all in some form or another, whether it's because of declining air quality or actual fire in our communities. So just to give you a somewhat of an outline, and especially to put the two dissertation chapters that I'll talk about, there's one in the middle that I'm not talking about today because I didn't think it would be quite as relevant to this particular audience, but I'll talk today about the project origins, of how this project came to be, and give ecocultural background into the conditions in Karuk ancestral territory and kind of what's going on there in order to better understand what happens then in my dissertation. And then today I'll be, let's see. So the first chapter is called Under the Guise of Science, How the U.S. Forest Service Deployed Settler, Colonial, and Racist Logics to Advance an Unsubstantiated Fire Suppression Agenda. Quite the mouthful. But that's the empirical chapter of my dissertation, and that'll be the focus of the majority of today's talk. But then I wanted to end on a high note. So, the first half of the talk will be very depressing, and then we will uplift with the third chapter, which is called Drawing from Karuk World Renewal, Illustrating More Than Human Agency and Relationality in the Klamath River Basin, which was a methodological exploration into the value of digital illustration as a tool for the tribe to communicate its cultural objectives, its practices, and also for me to communicate cross-culturally as a settler working with the tribe, and kind of how that tool became like a real methodological gift, I guess, that really took on kind of a life of its own and became this very fringe and interesting chapter in my dissertation. Then I'll make a course plug for a graduate course I'm teaching, and then we'll move into questions. Okay, so project origins. Since 2016, I formed part of a research team of Karuk scientists, knowledge holders, and settler allies, developing a climate change vulnerability assessment and then a subsequent climate adaptation plan for the Karuk Department of Natural Resources. This team initially included Ron Reed on the upper left, Bill Tripp in the center top, Frank Lake on the top right, me obviously, Kari in the middle, my advisor, and Leif Hillman on the bottom left. And since then, it has evolved and grown to have a lot more people involved. But my dissertation project was born out of some of the tribal needs and questions that emerged during these prior research collaborations with the tribe. So diving into the ecocultural context, Karuk people sometimes refer to themselves as fix the world people. In the Karuk language, the word pikiaf roughly translates to fix it. And Karuk World Renewal, which is a set of ceremonies, but really kind of like the Karuk epistemology for land management, is the English term to describe Pikiawish, right, which is a derivative of Pikiaf. And it refers to these annual vital ceremonies that Karuk people hold, in which they carry out cyclical responsibilities towards their biotic community. And then finally, another variation of Pikiaf is Ik Pikiaf, which is in the title of my dissertation. And it means to fix again. And I use it to reference the effort that it takes to renew Karuk ecological relationships under the intertwined challenges of federal land management and climate change, which both stem from colonialism. So to fix again is kind of where Karuk folks find themselves now, right, in their current struggle to reestablish their cultural burning practices, which we'll dive into next. So fire is a central element in Karuk world renewal, and it is a key process that links Karuk people to ancestral landscapes and their more than human kin, right? They conceive of other species as relatives and as entities to which they hold a responsibility, a reciprocal responsibility. And so burning landscapes at strategic times of year maintains these fire-adapted ecosystems in the Klamath River Basin and promotes these culturally significant species such as tan oaks, huckleberries, elk, as you can see in these pictures. It rids the land of pests and disease. It reduces fuel loads and even reduces stream temperatures for salmon in the peak heat of summer, right? And salmon are another really vital species that is experiencing challenges for other pressures related more to agricultural water use that is reducing the stream flow. So unfortunately, cultural burning is severely limited by the ongoing occupation of Karuk lands by the US Forest Service. And here's a map of Karuk ancestral landscape. The yellow line is delineating that the estimated ancestral landscape of the Karuk, which is over 1 million acres in what is contemporarily known as Northern California. And then the green represents public lands. And within the Karuk ancestral boundaries, it's almost entirely dominated by the Forest Service. And so in effect, 98% of Karuk ancestral territory is currently under contested jurisdiction with the Forest Service. The Forest Service's zealous commitment to fire suppression didn't just start in this continent. Historical analyses document that it had European origins where pro-fire rural peasants clashed with urban dwelling scientists who saw fire as destructive. And because the Forest Service's forestry principles were modeled off of German forestry, it inherited this perception of fire as a destructive disturbance, despite the vital role of it in many, many landscapes in the American West, including Karuk ancestral landscapes territory. So this quote here by Pine hints at two important elements I later discuss in my findings. The quote states, "The collision of European forestry with indigenous landscapes sparked a public debate about appropriate fire practices and policies. The celebrated light burning controversy in America had cognates in the early burning debates that were kindled throughout the British Empire. Over and over again, they interpreted fire in political rather than environmental terms, as the graffiti of ecological vandals, as the torches of barn burners and rural vigilantes, and the protest of a folk both sullen and pre-scientific." And so the light burning controversy, the first bolded set of words there, is key to my analysis because it was actually a controversy I wasn't even aware of when I went into this research, and then kind of discovered its significance as I was analyzing documents. And so it's a controversy that erupted in the field of forestry in the 1920s about the value of light burning, which is the terminology that was used at the time for what today we might more commonly refer to as prescribed burning. And so as we will find out, prominent conservationists, and especially the Forest Service, were adamantly on the anti-light burning side of things. The other element is this mention of burning being the practice of the pre-scientific, right? So very much drawing the line between those legitimized by science versus those who have other ways of knowing that were deemed invalid. And so one of the major ecological implications of this large-scale federal occupation is that many landscapes that need fire to retain their ecological integrity have not burned for decades. And the Forest Service used its state power, its control over a massive land base, access to military caliber equipment, and the legitimizing force of Western science to establish itself as the utmost national expert in fire suppression. And in the process, it made indigenous burning practices illegal. Then starting in the 1960s, this curious thing happens where the Forest Service starts embracing prescribed fire and later seeking partnerships with the very indigenous peoples whose practices they had criminalized. For example, the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership is a contemporary collaboration led by the Karuk tribe, along with the Klamath and Six Rivers National Forest, in which the key objective is to return Karuk burning practices to the Klamath River Basin. So while Karuk indigenous knowledge had remained steadfast that whole time in valuing fire as an essential ecosystem management tool, in the last century, Forest Service fire science has reversed its position. So when I started contemplating this radical management shift, it really intrigued me, and I decided I really wanted to examine whether and how the Forest Service justified this highly consequential change. Specifically, the question I wanted to explore was the following. What does Forest Service discourse from 1905, which was the institution of the contemporary iteration of the Forest Service, to the present, tell us about the agency's shifting fire science when analyzed through the lens of settler colonial theory? And the resulting analysis, which I'm about to present, produced the first article under the guise of science that emerged from my dissertation, which then was published in Environmental Sociology in October of last year. So because maybe many folks in here are not super familiar with settler colonial theory, I wanted to go over the theoretical foundations of kind of how I interpreted the information that I was reading, the historical documents and contemporary discourse coming out of the Forest Service. So settler colonial theory is a crucial theoretical framework that emerges out of various social sciences, including in sociology, through which to analyze this topic, because the question at hand involves an agency of the settler state occupying indigenous territory, criminalizing indigenous practices, and then imposing colonial land management regimes. And so really settler colonial theory is an instrumental theoretical lens through which to understand this particular issue, and it hadn't really been done in the way that, in a chronological way, like I decided to pursue. And so settler colonial theory and Bacon's concept of colonial ecological violence help us understand settler colonialism as not just a long ago event that, occurred during first contact between, European settlers and indigenous peoples, but as an ongoing eco-social structure privileging settlers at and the settler state at the expense of indigenous peoples via violence that often takes on an ecological dimension. So settler control of indigenous land and the genocide and continual erasure of indigenous peoples are central to settler colonial pursuits. My article is also informed by Norgaard's concept of, and that's Kari Norgaard's concept of racial colonial formation, which posits that indigenous peoples are subject first and foremost to settler violence, but are also as part of that process racialized as a means of further dispossession. And like, for example, heterogeneous indigenous peoples were racialized under the single term Indian, which embodies various stereotypes that produced and upheld white settlers. Produced and upheld by white settlers. And the most consequential racialized narratives are those of the savage and the vanishing Indian, which continue to be deployed by settlers to this day, right? The savage being like uneducated, unscientific, unable to manage their own affairs, and the vanishing Indian, like kind of this like noble but disappearing savage that really, without being saved by settlers, is just gonna disappear and become extinct. Finally, this article is informed by theories of knowledge, science, and the state, in which the production of knowledge and construction of categories is an exercise dominated by entities holding symbolic power, such as the state and Western scientific institutions. So how did I answer this question? I embarked on a content analysis of national and regional Forest Service discourse on fire suppression from 1905 to present, with a special focus on California's branch of the Forest Service, and specifically the Klamath and Six Rivers National Forest, which is where the two forests that sit upon Karuk ancestral territory. And this also involved a visit to the Six Rivers National Forest Heritage Library, where a lot of historic documents are held. I then scanned all these articles and discourse documents, coded them in Atlas TI. And then upon my initial coding, I expanded the search for light burning controversy and Paiute forestry, which we'll talk about in a second, as I realized the special significance of these terms in relation to this case. And then I supplemented primary data analysis with secondary data detailing the history of the Forest Service and Karuk tribal forest fire management. So let's dig into the findings. One of the most surprising findings for me, like when I went into this, I thought that I was just going to find an absence of indigenous mention, right? Which in itself would be significant and it would kind of allude to the erasure of indigenous peoples that is very common in settler colonial practices. But to my surprise, I actually found explicitly racializing language in Forest Service discourse in regards to indigenous burning practices. And one of the ways this came through was through the use of the term Paiute forestry by Forest Service leadership in outward facing discourse. And so Paiute forestry was basically racialized code for forestry that was backward, lacking expertise, and savage, right? And it used this term Paiute forestry, which of course is in, and it was spelled in that way by the agency, which is why I use that spelling. But that is, of course, the name of a specific set of tribes in the US, some of which inhabit parts of Utah. But it was used homogeneously to kind of blanket statement refer to indigenous burning practices in this racialized way that signifies inferiority and lack of knowledge and expertise. So it kind of got used in a way akin to Indian, right? Where it's this homogenizing term that really erases the place and culture specific practices of hundreds of indigenous communities under the name of a single cultural group, right? The Paiute in this case. And importantly, the other thing about this racializing practice was that the Forest Service started using it not just to refer to indigenous peoples, but especially to down talk settlers that were in favor of burning. So kind of like, if you're a real settler, or if you're like anybody with any kind of expertise, like, what are you, into Paiute forestry? Kind of like this like degrading talk that wanted to make settlers toe the line into the fire suppression side of things by racializing them as, you know, natives, basically. So an example of this discourse can be found in an article titled Paiute Forestry or the Fallacy of Light Burning, written by William Greeley, who then became the third chief of the Forest Service in 1920, shortly after writing this. And so he states, the advocates of light burning or Paiute forestry assert that fire should not be kept out of the pine forests. They claim that their scheme was practiced by the Indians in various western pine forests long before the advent of the white man, asserting that the noble redskin fired the forest regularly, not so much to facilitate his hunting or protect his dwelling as because his nature lore taught him that this was the way to prevent big forest fire. So this is in 1920 at the height of the light burning debate. Another example of racializing discourse comes from the Region 5 foresters Crone, Miller, and Kern, who in 1949 wrote a general inspection report for the Six Rivers National Forest on Kaduk ancestral territory. And the authors here equate incendiarism in the Klamath River Basin with the retaliatory acts of the, quote, drunken Indian, stating, solving the problem of the half-drunk Indian and his retaliatory actions is a long process involving possible A, enforcement of liquor laws in respect to Indians, and B, long-time educational programs in agriculture and forestry among the high school students. Law enforcement is, of course, essential, but it is a much different problem than that of the white man's conception. Yet no one seems able to say what is proper punishment for an Indian. One sheriff says a rubber hose filled with buckshot is perhaps the best. Indigenous burning had not been disregarded by all settlers, as I alluded to before with the Paiute forestry discussion. In fact, some settlers and even settler-owned corporations were light burning advocates whose vision of land management aligned more closely with indigenous burning practices, even if their motivations and ethics differed. In an effort to recruit these ambivalent settlers to their ideological camp, the Forest Service worked to delegitimize indigenous peoples and knowledge using three key tactics that align with racialized narratives that persist to this day. So there was discrediting, which kind of relied on this savage narrative, downplaying, which relied on the vanishing Indian narrative, and then erasure, which relied on the terra nullius narrative, right? Where like any land that is inhabited by indigenous peoples really is empty land that is up for grabs. So one example of discrediting indigenous practices by deploying the savage narrative comes from an essay by Aldo Leopold in 1920 titled Paiute Forestry versus Forest Fire Prevention. At the time, Leopold was an assistant district forester for the Forest Service in the Southwest, and as many of you probably know, would eventually rise as a leading conservation figure. In his essay, he states, "It is up to the public and especially the users of the forest to decide whether they wish fire suppression policy continued or whether they wish to try Paiute forestry. It is of course absurd to assume that the Indians fired the forest with any idea of forest conservation in mind. As is well known to all old timers, the Indian fired the forest with the deliberate intent of confusing and concentrating the game so as to make hunting easier. A bunch of deer with their heads in the air, waiting for a fire, presented an easy mark, even to the Indians' bow and arrow. And it was this fact and not any desire for fancied forest conservation which caused the Indians to burn the forests." An example of downplaying in which kind of like the vanishing Indian is a disappearing person that is going to hasn't had much impact and will not continue to have impact upon landscapes came from the California Forest Service's Ranger Catechism, which was basically a publication intended to inform the public about what Forest Service rangers, what their job entails and kind of like what forest practices are in the state of California. And so they would answer questions asked by the public, including, why did Indians start fires in the forest? And their response was, tradition says that they did so to drive out game, but no positive proof can be found that they did this as a regular custom over any large areas. The probabilities are that Indians set very few fires, which of course contemporarily has been disputed by many studies. Oops. And then in terms of an example of erasure, this tactic was to simply omit any discussion of indigenous peoples altogether, deploying a terra nullius narrative, even in places where the presence of indigenous communities was integral to local ecosystems and even Forest Service operations. So remember the Crone, Miller, and Kern quote I just read about the drunken Indians, right? Like clearly they had been concerned about indigenous presence and like the setting of fires in that forest. Well, just 1 year after they wrote that report, the prospectus for the Six Rivers National Forest outlines the purposes and goals of the forest and doesn't mention tribes or indigenous peoples even once, as though and there are like contemporarily, there are 12 distinct tribes, including the Kaduk tribe, in government to government consultation with that same forest. So just an illustration of erasure as a tactic that was also unfolding. So given the Forest Service's strict fervor for fire suppression and self-proclaimed scientific backing for this particular management approach, one would assume that the agency was basing its forest management on scientific data. But surprisingly, very little research was dedicated to properly investigating the benefits or harms of prescribed fire. The vast majority of fire research funding went to adapt wartime technologies for the purposes of fire suppression. And of course, we see a lot of that technology deployed today. And even when the Forest Service did embark on experiments, it was often with the intent to disprove the value of prescribed burning. In fact, a Forest Service publication documenting the history of fire research within the agency tells tales of scientists compromising their own experiments and concealing research results that may point towards the benefits of fire. So in the Southeast, the Forest Service carried out demonstration plots to disprove the value of light burning, only to find that their experiments failed. And Pine mentions this particular case and says, like novice students told to redo an experiment until they got the right result, the trials were repeated and the results were kept in file cabinets. They were treated as if probably untrue, but if true, then dangerous. And then in Northern California, Forest Service researcher S.B. Show and his colleague E.I. Kotak conducted a study in 1919 in the Snake Lake area. And in that particular Forest Service publication documenting the history of Forest Service fire research, Smith states that the stakes were so high that the two men actually sabotaged their own research They placed pine limbs alongside a few large fire-scarred pines to ensure that they would burn and demonstrate the danger of the technique to marketable timber. So the other thing that I found interesting, so Pine, who writes extensively about the Forest Service and just the clash between Indigenous and state fire practices, both in the US and Australia and other places, he mentioned that the fire revolution aligned with national social transformations that were occurring at the time. And he calls the fire revolution basically that moment when the Forest Service decided that they might actually contemplate prescribed burning as a viable strategy. And so in the Klamath River Basin at the regional level, this is also true, even if the timing was slightly delayed because California was kind of the last stronghold of absolute fire suppression. So in the 1960s, you have the civil rights movement, you have the American Indian movement, and you have, on a national level, but not quite in California, you have the Forest Service beginning to reconsider their stance on fire. And this was especially true in the Southeast. I think that kind of revelation happened sooner down there. And in the 1970s, you have the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, which then allows for tribal governments to become instituted. And the Karuk begin the process of gaining federal recognition, which they obtain in 79. So by the 80s, they have that federal recognition and they begin to form a tribal government and also begin to kind of coalesce with allies in the region in direct action protests against the Forest Service. Then in the 90s, also in the 80s, I guess I should note that the Department of Natural Resources, I believe, gets instituted in the 80s or maybe early 90s. And then the Karuk tribe in the 1990s begin collaborative management with the Forest Service. And then finally in the 2000s, you have the Karuk tribe leading the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership with the key goal of returning fire to the landscape. So you have this sequence of events in which socio-political events and kind of like the gaining of power by the Karuk tribe because of these various national and regional movements and coalitions actually starts to shift the fire science in the Klamath River Basin. So it is now pretty widely acknowledged among Western scientists that Forest Service fire suppression policy was a misguided management approach, and that in fact, light burners had been right all along. And despite this general recognition, the Forest Service in its contemporary discourse diffuses blame and continues to erase Indigenous peoples. An example of such discourse comes out of the Klamath National Forest website, which states, since the beginning of time, fires have burned in the forest, playing a vital role in keeping the land healthy. As civilization moved deeper into the forest, fire came to be seen as an enemy that destroyed lives, property, and natural resources. As a result, the nation demanded that the Forest Service exclude fire from our environment. Over time, it became apparent that our success had many unforeseen consequences. Without fire, our forests became overcrowded and vulnerable to attacks by insects and disease. So there's a lot to unpack here in this statement. First of all, the concept that civilization didn't really arrive into the forest until settlement, right? So Indigenous cultures as not representing civilization in any capacity. Then this concept of the nation demanding fire suppression, when in fact the light burning debate really illustrates how it wasn't so clear cut. There was settlers that were opposed to it, and there was actually a lot of contention, and the Forest Service then embarked on campaigns that continue to this day to really convince everyone that fire suppression is the most viable management practice. And then, really failing to acknowledge their unsubstantiated management practices by calling it success with many unforeseen consequences, right? So to kind of summarize the findings of this particular article, Western science is not a value neutral way of knowing, but rooted in the social, cultural, and political context in which it is produced and disseminated. Scientific rigor is hindered by settler, colonial, and racist constructs that limit what we consider viable or even testable knowledge, right? The erasure of Indigenous peoples has major ecological consequences that affect Indigenous and settler communities. And settler colonialism is an ongoing social structure that continuously dispossesses Indigenous people. But let's dive into the more optimistic part of my dissertation. And so just to give you some context as to how this chapter even arose, which is kind of a very unusual chapter even in sociology. It kind of combines the humanities and sociological frameworks. It is pretty interdisciplinary, but part of my objective with my dissertation project was to really produce products that were of value to the tribe. And things that they could use and that could enhance capacity for their various tribal initiatives. And initially we had talked about me doing a GIS analysis of historic aerial photography of Karuk ancestral territory, but then COVID basically shut down the National Archives and made that project impossible. So we went with Plan B, and I had been producing illustrations for the tribe for some time before my dissertation. And so we decided that I was just gonna use illustrations and have that be kind of the product that I could contribute in addition to just, publishing research that was illustrating some of the challenges involved in restoring Karuk burning practices. So the question that, then I folded these illustrations into some sort of sociological analysis. And what I aimed to answer was, how does visual illustration intersect with Indigenous research methods? And how does it help convey Karuk world renewal? And so to give a general sense, Indigenous research is theorized by Wilson and Hughes, and it basically is research that centers Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. It is research that is relational, in which you are accountable to other people, species, your ancestors, the land, et cetera. And that includes if you're a settler, right? It all is like within that context. And that knowledge is alive and in motion, and it is born not just out of cognitive processes, but also sensory, emotional, and spiritual knowing, intuition, dreams, and cultural knowing. And so one of the ways in which the animism of Indigenous knowledges is most celebrated is through story. And Archibald uses the process and principles of Indigenous storytelling as taught by her Stalo and Coast Salish elders to develop a research methodology that she refers to as Indigenous story work. Tuck and Mackenzie explained that Archibald's Indigenous story work has major implications for Indigenous methods of critical place research because knowledge of place is held in stories. And stories can take many forms, as Wilson and Hughes point out. Stories are a way that knowledge communicates and participates in relationships, which can occur whether stories are shared orally, visually, through dance, song, poetry, or sometimes through writing them down in English. And in fact, illustrations do tell stories, right? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I wanted to read this long but descriptive quote that speaks to the value of illustration in Karuk country in particular, as described by Karuk DNR director Bill Tripp. And this was a conversation we had while standing on the side of the road in front of Offfield Mountain, which is a sacred site that I was going to do illustrations about. It's good for intergenerational learning. I imagine just about every segment of society has somebody that doesn't really like to do the reading part of things. I never did. I had to be practicing. I'm more visual kinetic, A long time ago, you would go to this ridge and look for these things and see this stuff and pay attention to this. It's not exactly the same. It's not entirely something you are able to do in today's education system. You're not able to access the youth for those things. And so having something like this as a surrogate helps because it's something they can actually look at and say, hey, I've seen that on the landscape before, and I understand what they are talking about because I have this visual of this situation and this place and what this lesson in school is about. So I can look at that through life, and maybe in 30 years, I can say, this is what it looked like back then. This is what we did, and this is what it looks like now. In the end, that's the kind of thing that will end up being valuable too. You never can tell what's going to be valuable 40 years down the road. And so echoing what Bill Tripp describes, Cajete explains that an Indigenous education model must honor the process of visioning, which embodies and focuses our creative power to visualize and realize new entities in communion with others and with our spirit. He goes on to state that it is no wonder that visions held and continue to hold such an important place in many Indian societies. The process of visioning is a basic creative response to making meaning of life. Visions are indeed for life's sake. So with all that context in place, let's dive into some of these illustrations and discuss their significance. These illustrations that I made over the course of several years, I think they ended up being about 20 illustrations. They were all produced in Photoshop with constant Kaduk input and revision. Over the course of producing over 20 of these graphics, I've really come to appreciate illustration, not just as a means to an end product, but as a generative creative process in which I engage deeply with the ecology of Kaduk places. For example, this graphic here represents Kaduk relationality and the way in which Kaduk land management considers the interconnections between species. Humans are among the species included, but not at the center, just another part of, right? The symbiosis between species was really what was crucial for me to illustrate. The DNR really wanted me to emphasize the relationship between the tan oak roots and the mycelial mats of the tan oak mushroom. So graphics can convey this relational information much more effectively and viscerally in 5 seconds than if you were to write it down in a paragraph. These graphics are also helpful in representing Kaduk cultural burning practices and the highly specific phenological cycles that characterize the timing of burns. So this is one graphic in a sequence that I'm still producing, in which the pine duff is being burned in late winter, and then in subsequent graphics in the series, we show how later in the year the grasses bordering the manzanita get burned, and so on. And so I found illustrations particularly useful in conveying cycles and relationships which are really vital in Kaduk world renewal and in many indigenous epistemologies. Another benefit of the illustrations was in normalizing beneficial fire and smoke through visual exposure. So most settlers only have experience with catastrophic fire and perhaps even carry wildfire-related trauma. Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kaduk, on the other hand, because of traditional practices, are much more likely to understand fire on a spectrum that ranges from controlled and therapeutic to out of control and damaging. And so if cultural burning is to be restored in its full magnitude, then folks like the Kaduk tribe and settlers, so not just indigenous peoples, but settlers as well, must come to understand the full spectrum of fire and relatedly of smoke. So in this graphic, we contest settler discourses of catastrophe and vulnerability by illustrating how fire smoke in the peak of summer, which would seem like a real terrible situation, while having potential health implications, also brings with it important ecological benefits in the form of localized inversions that shade the river and then cool the water for temperature sensitive salmon in a water system that is already under a lot of stress. And then finally, illustration has the capacity to facilitate indigenous visioning and summon a longed-for future in which colonial wounds are healed. And I mentioned this story yesterday, so it's blown for a lot of you, but when tribal staff asked me to incorporate a condor flying over a Kaduk mother and child harvesting hazelnuts, I was surprised. Are there condors in Kaduk country, I asked. Not right now, Shay said. They used to be, and we're hoping they will be again. Condors were extirpated from most US regions by the combined colonial impacts of lead and DDT poisoning. And he explained that the Yurok tribe downriver were working on bringing them back, and he had hope. So he asked me to add a condor as a defiant foreshadowing, right? So it's up in the corner. And then lo and behold, this spring, and 2 years after I had produced that graphic, the Yurok Condor Restoration Program released a pair of condors into the skies over the Klamath River Basin. And after a 100-year absence, they are now once again flying the skies, like was foreshadowed in the illustration. That concludes my presentation. But I'm going to make a plug for this course that I am teaching in the spring called Multi-Species Justice and Indigenous Approaches to the Environment, in which we're going to read about the way that humans and their ecosystems are interconnected, the relationships between various species, and read indigenous authors' work around conceptualizing the environment and expanding disciplinary boundaries. So I'm not entirely sure if that's the right number, but it's the right title. So look and find that title if you're interested. And so thank you so much. And if you have questions or comments, we have, I think, 15 minutes.